My name is Daniel. I'm 70, retired for 7 years. I had $1.2 million saved, a solid pension, and a detailed plan. I thought I was ready for anything retirement could throw at me. I was wrong about everything that actually mattered. Let me tell you what really happens when you retire. For 40 years, I lived what I thought was the American dream. I worked my way up from floor supervisor to plant manager at Henderson Manufacturing, a mid-sized company that made automotive parts. Every morning at 6:30, I'd kiss my wife goodbye, grab my coffee, and drive the same route to the same office where I'd spend the next 10 hours solving problems, managing people, and building something I was proud of. But here's what I was really building during those 4 decades: a retirement plan that looked perfect on paper. I put away 15% of every single paycheck for 25 years. While my colleagues were buying bigger houses or fancier cars, I was maxing out my 401k, funding my IRA and watching those numbers grow. My financial advisor, a sharp young man in expensive suits, would show me charts and graphs that made my future look golden. According to his calculations, I'd have enough money to maintain my lifestyle well into my 90s. I became obsessed with those numbers. I attended every retirement seminar my company offered. I read books with titles like Your Golden Years Start Here and Retirement: The Best Years of Your Life. I had spreadsheets that calculated my withdrawal rates down to the penny. I knew exactly how much I could spend each month without touching the principal. The 4% rule was my gospel, and I preached it to anyone who would listen. My wife caught the fever too. She started collecting retirement magazines and created what she called her dream boards on Pinterest. Pictures of couples walking hand in hand on tropical beaches, images of RVs parked beside mountain lakes, snapshots of perfectly groomed golf courses. We'd sit at the kitchen table on Sunday mornings, planning the trips we'd take and the hobbies we'd finally have time to pursue. She talked about learning to paint watercolors. I dreamed about perfecting my golf swing and maybe building furniture in the garage workshop I'd always wanted. The retirement industry fed our fantasies beautifully. Every piece of literature showed the same images: silver-haired couples laughing over wine, grandparents teaching children to fish, retirees volunteering at charities with satisfied smiles on their faces. The financial seminars painted retirement as an extended vacation funded by decades of responsible saving. They talked about healthcare costs, sure, but their estimates seemed reasonable. They mentioned inflation, but their projections made it look manageable. What they never mentioned, not once in all those seminars and brochures, was what happens to your soul when you stop being useful. Nobody talked about the psychological impact of losing your professional identity overnight. There were no charts showing the depression rates among new retirees, no graphs illustrating the divorce statistics for couples suddenly spending 24 hours a day together. Ask yourself this question: are you planning a retirement or are you planning a 40-year vacation? Because I was definitely planning a vacation, and vacations end. The final year before my retirement was intoxicating. My colleagues would pat me on the back and tell me how lucky I was. "Living the dream, Daniel," they'd say with envy in their voices. The company threw me a beautiful retirement party. 40 people gathered in the conference room, eating cake and listening to speeches about my dedication and service. I felt like a celebrity. I had made it to the finish line that so many people dream about but never reach. When I cleaned out my office on that last Friday, boxing up 40 years of accumulated memories and achievements, I felt a tiny flutter of uncertainty. Standing in that empty room, looking at the bare walls where my awards used to hang, I experienced a moment of vertigo. For just a second, I wondered who I would be without this place, without these responsibilities, without the daily purpose that had defined me for so long. But I pushed that thought away. I had trained for this moment my entire adult life. I had the money, I had the plans, and I had the dreams. My wife and I were going to travel, to explore, to finally live the life we'd been postponing for 4 decades. We were going to be the couple in those magazine photos, walking hand in hand into our golden sunset. I thought the hardest part was behind me. All those years of saving, all that delayed gratification, all those sacrifices had paid off. I was financially prepared, emotionally ready, and excited about the future. I believed I had thought of everything, planned for every contingency, and set myself up for success. Standing in that empty office, holding my final paycheck, I felt like I was graduating from life itself. The real world was about to begin, and I was ready for it. At least that's what I told myself as I walked out of Henderson Manufacturing for the last time, my retirement dreams tucked safely in my back pocket like a winning lottery ticket I couldn't wait to cash in. I had no idea that within 6 months I'd be Googling retirement depression at 2 in the morning, wondering what had gone so terribly wrong. The first month of retirement felt like winning the lottery. For the first time in 40 years, I woke up without an alarm clock. Do you know what that feels like after decades of being jolted awake at 5:30 every morning? It felt like pure freedom. I'd lie in bed listening to my wife getting ready for her part-time job at the library, and I'd smile knowing I didn't have to move until I wanted to. I attacked my honey-do list with the enthusiasm of a man who finally had time. I painted the guest bedroom that had needed attention for 3 years. I organized the garage until every tool had its designated spot. I fixed the leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom, cleaned out the gutters, and power washed the deck. My wife would come home from work to find me proudly showing off my latest accomplishment, and she'd smile and praise my productivity. Those first weeks, I felt like I was on permanent vacation. I'd take long walks through our neighborhood in the middle of the day, noticing things I'd never seen before because I'd always been at work. I discovered that the Johnsons had a beautiful garden, that the new family on Maple Street had painted their house a lovely shade of blue, that there was a small park just 3 blocks away that I'd driven past for 15 years without really seeing. I started going to restaurants for lunch, something that had been reserved for weekends or special occasions. Sitting in a diner on a Tuesday afternoon, surrounded by other retirees and shift workers, I felt rebellious and sophisticated. I'd order the daily special and read the newspaper cover to cover, savoring every article because I finally had time to digest the world around me. My wife seemed genuinely excited to share this new phase of life with me. She'd call me from the library during her breaks, and we'd make plans for dinner or evening walks. She started leaving little notes suggesting projects we could tackle together or places we might visit on the weekends. For those first few weeks, retirement felt exactly like the magazines had promised. But then the projects ran out. By month 3, I had completed every item on our home improvement list. The house was in better shape than it had been in years, but I found myself walking from room to room looking for something, anything that needed my attention. I'd already reorganized the basement twice and alphabetized our DVD collection. The garage was so perfectly organized that I was afraid to use any of the tools for fear of disrupting the system. The days started stretching out before me like empty highways. I'd finish breakfast and realize it was only 8:30 in the morning, and I had no obligations, no meetings, no deadlines, no responsibilities until dinner. Television became my companion in a way it had never been before. I found myself watching morning talk shows, afternoon game shows, and cooking programs for foods I'd never make. My wife began to notice the change. She'd come home from her 3-day-a-week job to find me still in the same chair where she'd left me, still wearing the same clothes from the morning. Her enthusiasm for my daily activities started to wane when my biggest accomplishment became finishing the crossword puzzle or reorganizing the spice rack for the 3rd time. Look inside your own heart right now and honestly ask yourself this question. What will you do with 2,400 extra hours per year when you retire? Because that's what you get when you stop working a full-time job. And I can tell you that those hours stretch out like taffy when you don't have a purpose to fill them. The worst part was how the days began to blur together. Without the structure of work, without the natural rhythm of weekdays versus weekends, time became this shapeless mass that I couldn't get a grip on. Tuesday felt exactly like Saturday, which felt exactly like Thursday. I'd wake up and have to think for a moment to remember what day it was, and then realize it didn't matter anyway. My wife and I had our first real argument about my retirement during month 4. She came home from work to find me exactly where she'd left me that morning, watching a rerun of a cooking show I'd seen twice before. When she asked what I'd done with my day, I couldn't give her a satisfactory answer because I honestly couldn't remember. The morning had somehow evaporated into afternoon, and the afternoon had melted into evening, and I had nothing to show for any of it. She told me later that watching me waste away on the couch was breaking her heart. She said I looked like a deflated balloon, like someone had let all the air out of the man she'd been married to for 35 years. She wasn't angry, she said. She was worried. And that was worse than anger because I could see the fear in her eyes when she looked at me. By month 6, I was Googling retirement depression at 2 in the morning while she slept beside me. I read articles about retirees who'd gained weight, lost friends, and struggled with purposelessness. I learned that the first year of retirement has one of the highest rates of depression among any major life transition, higher even than divorce or job loss. I discovered that men in particular struggle with the loss of professional identity because we're conditioned to define ourselves by our work. But reading about it and living it are two different things. I went from feeling like the master of my own destiny to feeling completely invisible. The phone stopped ringing. My opinions on work-related matters were no longer needed or wanted. I went from being someone people called for advice to being someone people politely asked about my health and the weather. I had become a professional retiree, and I was failing at it miserably. November 3rd, 2020 started like every other Tuesday in my retirement. I woke up at 7:30 without an alarm, made coffee in the same mug I'd been using for months, and settled into my recliner with the morning news. The routine had become as predictable as my old work schedule, except infinitely more hollow. My wife had already left for her book club, the one bright spot in our social calendar that didn't include me. I remember the news was particularly depressing that morning. The pandemic was still raging, the election aftermath was ugly, and everything on television seemed designed to make you angry or afraid. I turned it off after 20 minutes and found myself staring out the window at nothing in particular. The neighbor across the street was loading his car for work, and I felt a strange pang of envy watching him check his phone and hurry with purpose. Around 10:30, I decided to take my usual walk around the neighborhood. Exercise was one of the few things my doctor had insisted I maintain, though I'd been less consistent about it lately. The October air was crisp, and I thought the movement might shake off the fog that seemed to settle over me most mornings. I'd been feeling more tired than usual, more sluggish, but I attributed it to the general malaise that had become my constant companion. 3 blocks from home, I felt the first squeeze in my chest. It started as a dull pressure, like someone was gently pressing their fist against my breastbone. I stopped walking and took a deep breath, waiting for it to pass. When you're 65 and carrying 20 extra pounds from 2 years of purposeless eating, you tell yourself these little discomforts are just part of getting older. But the pressure didn't ease. If anything, it got worse. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead despite the cool weather, and I felt a wave of nausea that made me lean against a mailbox. The pain started radiating down my left arm, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice I'd been ignoring for months finally broke through the denial. Something is very wrong. I walked home faster than I should have, probably making everything worse, but I was suddenly desperate to get inside my own house. I told myself it was just heartburn from the coffee, or maybe a pulled muscle from moving furniture the day before. I took 2 antacids and sat in my chair, willing the discomfort to disappear. 30 minutes later, the pain was worse, not better. I was sweating through my shirt, and my breathing felt labored in a way that had nothing to do with the walk. For the first time in my adult life, I was genuinely scared about my health. I looked around our empty house and realized that if something serious was happening, there was no one there to help me. The drive to urgent care was the longest 15 minutes of my life. I kept the radio off because I needed to concentrate on staying calm, on breathing evenly, on not panicking. I rehearsed what I'd say to the doctor. Probably just heartburn, probably nothing serious, but my wife would kill me if I didn't get it checked out. I was already planning how I'd laugh about this later, how embarrassed I'd be about overreacting. The nurse at urgent care took one look at the EKG readout and called for the doctor immediately. I could see it in her face before she said a word. The casual efficiency disappeared, replaced by the kind of focused attention that medical professionals reserve for genuine emergencies. The doctor, a young woman who looked impossibly competent, studied the printout for what felt like an eternity. "Sir, we're admitting you immediately," she said, and those 6 words changed everything. "You're having a heart attack. We need to get you to the hospital right now." The ambulance ride is a blur of sirens and concerned faces and phone calls to my wife. I remember thinking absurdly that this was the most excitement I'd had in 2 years. I also remember the terrible clarity that settled over me as we raced through traffic toward the cardiac unit. Lying on that stretcher with electrodes stuck to my chest and an IV in my arm, I finally understood what had been happening to me. I hadn't been living since I retired. I'd been dying by degrees, so gradually that I hadn't noticed. The heart attack wasn't a random medical event. It was my body's final protest against the slow suffocation of my spirit. 2 years of purposelessness, of feeling useless and invisible, of watching my identity dissolve one boring day at a time, had literally broken my heart. The emergency room at 3 in the morning is a strange place for revelations, but that's where mine came. Hooked up to monitors and waiting for test results, I had the first honest conversation with myself that I'd had since retirement began. The heart attack was terrifying, but the numbness I'd been living with for months was worse. At least physical pain meant I was still alive. I'm asking you, just as someone who's been there, to consider this question. What would you regret if tomorrow was your last day? Because lying in that hospital bed, I couldn't think of a single meaningful thing I'd done with my retirement. I'd spent 730 days existing, not living, and my body had finally called me out on it. When my wife burst into the emergency room at 4 in the morning, her hair uncombed and her face streaked with tears, I saw something in her eyes that broke my heart all over again. It wasn't just fear for my physical health. It was relief that anything had finally shaken me out of the coma I'd been living in since I left my job. The heart attack saved my life by forcing me to admit I'd stopped living it. The first bill from the hospital arrived 2 weeks after my discharge, and it hit me like a second heart attack. Despite having what I thought was excellent insurance coverage, my out-of-pocket expenses for 4 days in the cardiac unit totaled nearly $8,000. $8,000 that wasn't in any of my careful retirement calculations. My Medicare supplement plan, which my insurance agent had assured me was comprehensive, had gaps large enough to drive an ambulance through. The prescription costs alone shocked me into reality. My new heart medications cost $412 per month, even with insurance. $412 every single month for the rest of my life, and that was just for one condition. My financial advisor had estimated healthcare costs at about $200 monthly in his projections. We were double that amount before I'd even left the hospital parking lot. Within 6 months, we had to install a stair lift because my cardiologist was concerned about me climbing stairs during recovery. Another $3,000. We modified the shower with grab bars and a seat. Another $800. These weren't luxuries or conveniences, they were medical necessities that Medicare considered home improvements and wouldn't cover at all. My careful calculations, my spreadsheets with their neat rows and columns, my 4% withdrawal rate that was supposed to sustain us forever, suddenly looked like wishful thinking written by someone who'd never actually been old or sick. The emergency fund I'd built up over decades was disappearing faster than I'd thought possible, and we weren't even dealing with anything truly catastrophic yet. But the financial hit was nothing compared to the relationship earthquake that followed my heart attack. My wife and I had to face the truth that neither of us had been brave enough to say out loud. Our marriage was suffocating under the weight of too much togetherness. For 35 years, we'd had a rhythm that worked. She managed the household during the day while I was at work. I came home with stories and energy, and we shared our evenings and weekends. We'd been partners, not roommates. Retirement had turned us into cellmates. She'd come home from her part-time job to find me exactly where she'd left me, needing entertainment, needing conversation, needing her to make my purposeless days feel meaningful. I'd become a burden instead of a companion, and we both knew it even though neither of us wanted to say it. The breaking point came during my second week of recovery. She was helping me with a shower, something that felt humiliating for both of us, and I made some comment about how nice it was to finally have her undivided attention. The look she gave me was pure exhaustion, mixed with something that might have been resentment. That evening, she sat on the edge of our bed and said words I'll never forget. "Daniel, I married you for better or worse, not for lunch every single day for the rest of my life." She wasn't being cruel, she was being honest. We'd become strangers living in the same house, and my constant presence was suffocating the woman I'd loved for 4 decades. The social isolation was just as brutal as the marriage strain. I'd assumed that my work friendships would naturally transition into retirement friendships. But I learned that proximity and shared purpose had been the only things holding most of those relationships together. Without the daily interactions, the common problems to solve, the shared complaints about management, we had nothing to talk about. My closest colleague at the plant, a man I'd eaten lunch with for 15 years, called exactly twice after my retirement party. Both conversations were awkward and forced, filled with long pauses and generic questions about how I was keeping busy. He was still living in the world of deadlines and projects and workplace drama, while I was living in the world of doctor appointments and afternoon television. We might as well have been speaking different languages. Making new friends at 65 proved harder than I'd ever imagined. Where do you meet people when you don't have work as a natural gathering place? I tried joining a men's group at our church, but they were all either 10 years older than me and talking about their grandchildren, or 10 years younger and still working. I didn't fit anywhere. The loneliness was physical. I could feel it in my chest, a hollow ache that had nothing to do with my heart condition. I went from managing a department of 12 people, being needed and consulted and respected, to talking to grocery store cashiers just to have human interaction. I started taking longer routes through stores just to have more opportunities for brief conversations with employees. Ask yourself this question and be brutally honest. Can your marriage handle retirement? Can your relationship survive the loss of the natural separation that work provides? Because if you think financial planning is hard, try planning for the psychological and emotional realities of spending every day with the same person when neither of you has anywhere else to go. The depression crept up so gradually that I didn't recognize it at first. I told myself I was just tired from the heart attack, just adjusting to the medications, just dealing with normal retirement stress. But my wife could see what I couldn't admit. I was sleeping 10 hours a night and still exhausted. I'd lost interest in food, in hobbies, in everything that used to give me pleasure. Pride kept me from seeking help when I desperately needed it. I was a 65-year-old man who'd successfully managed people and projects for decades. Admitting that I couldn't manage my own retirement felt like confessing to complete failure as an adult. So I suffered in silence, telling my wife I was fine, telling my doctor I was adjusting well, telling myself that tomorrow would be better. But tomorrow kept being exactly like today, and I was drowning in the life I'd spent 40 years planning to live. The cardiac rehabilitation program became my lifeline, though I didn't realize it at first. 3 days a week, I'd drive to the hospital's wellness center and spend an hour on monitored exercise equipment with other heart patients. The nurses watched our heart rates, blood pressure, and oxygen levels while we walked on treadmills and rode stationary bikes at carefully controlled intensities. But something more important than physical recovery was happening in that sterile room filled with beeping monitors. For the first time since retirement, I had a schedule that mattered. I had to be somewhere at a specific time, and people noticed if I didn't show up. The structure felt like water to a man dying of thirst. Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays suddenly had purpose again. More importantly, I met other men who were struggling with the same demons I'd been fighting. There was Robert, a retired teacher who'd had his heart attack 6 months into retirement. There was Frank, a former electrician who'd been forced into early retirement by his cardiac event. There was Michael, a retired postal worker who confessed during one of our cool-down sessions that he'd been more depressed before his heart attack than after it. We started talking during our sessions, quietly at first, then with growing honesty. These men understood something my family couldn't, that the heart attack wasn't the worst thing that had happened to us. The slow death of purpose, the gradual erosion of identity, the daily struggle with meaninglessness had been far more painful than any physical discomfort. Frank said something that changed my perspective forever. You know what the difference is between us and the guys who are thriving in retirement? They figured out who they wanted to be before they stopped being who they used to be. His words hit me like a physical blow because they were so obviously true. I'd spent decades planning financially for retirement, but zero time planning emotionally for it. Recovery wasn't just physical, it became existential. As my heart grew stronger, I started to understand that I needed to rebuild more than just my cardiovascular system. I needed to rebuild my entire approach to this stage of life. The man who'd had the heart attack couldn't continue living the way he'd been living, and that was actually a blessing disguised as a crisis. The first honest conversation with my wife about our retirement disappointment happened during my 6th week of recovery. I was feeling stronger physically, but I could see the strain in her face, the way she was carefully monitoring her words around me, afraid that any stress might trigger another cardiac event. We were both walking on eggshells in our own home. I asked her directly if she was happy with our retirement, and the question opened a floodgate. She cried for 20 minutes, telling me how frightened she'd been, not just of losing me to the heart attack, but of watching me disappear gradually over the previous 2 years. She said I'd become a ghost of myself, that the man she'd married had somehow evaporated and left behind this hollow stranger who needed constant entertainment and validation. She confessed that she'd been considering asking me to see a counselor, but she'd been afraid to suggest it because I'd always been so proud, so self-sufficient. She said watching me waste away on the couch had been like watching someone die in slow motion, and she'd felt helpless to stop it. That conversation led to our decision to try couples counseling, something neither of us had ever imagined we'd need. The counselor, a woman in her 60s who specialized in retirement transitions, helped us understand that we weren't failures. We were normal people dealing with an abnormal life change without any preparation or guidance. She taught us that retirement is essentially a second adolescence. Just as teenagers have to figure out who they are separate from their parents, retirees have to figure out who they are separate from their careers. The identity crisis, the mood swings, the relationship conflicts, the search for meaning and purpose are all normal parts of the process. We had to design our retirement instead of just falling into it. This meant having frank discussions about our individual needs for space, purpose, and social connection. It meant acknowledging that spending every waking moment together wasn't romantic. It was suffocating. It meant creating intentional structure in our days and weeks instead of letting time drift by without purpose. The breakthrough moment came when I realized I needed to be needed again, not needed in the desperate, clingy way I'd been leaning on my wife, but needed in the productive, contributory way that had defined my working years. The counselor asked me what had made me feel most alive during my career, and the answer was immediate: solving problems and helping people develop their potential. That insight led me to volunteer as a coordinator at our local food bank. The position required me to show up every Tuesday and Thursday morning to organize volunteer schedules, manage inventory, and solve the daily logistics problems that arose in feeding hungry families. Suddenly, I had people depending on me again, problems that needed my attention, and meaningful work that made a tangible difference. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself this critical question: what would make you feel valuable without a paycheck? Because retirement planning isn't just about having enough money to stop working. It's about finding enough purpose to keep living. The volunteer work led to opportunities to mentor young professionals through our church's career ministry. These conversations reminded me that my 40 years of work experience had value beyond the paycheck it had generated. I had knowledge, wisdom, and perspective that could help others navigate their careers more successfully. I also started doing part-time consulting work, not because we needed the money, but because I needed the mental stimulation and professional validation. Working 15 hours a week felt perfect, enough to engage my mind and skills without recreating the stress and demands that had defined my full-time career. The recovery process taught me that retirement isn't about stopping, it's about transitioning. It's about consciously choosing what to keep from your former life and what to release, what new elements to add, and what old patterns to abandon. My heart attack forced me to make these choices deliberately instead of letting them happen by default. If you're in your 40s right now listening to my story, you have something precious that I didn't fully appreciate when I was your age. Time to prepare for who you'll become when your career ends. Don't wait until you're 55 or 60 to start thinking about your identity beyond your job title. Start now, while you still have 25 years to develop the person you want to be in retirement. Begin cultivating interests and relationships that have nothing to do with your work. I spent 40 years defining myself entirely through my professional role, and when that disappeared, I had no idea who Daniel was underneath the plant manager. Join community organizations, develop hobbies that could become passionate pursuits, volunteer for causes that matter to you. These activities aren't just pleasant diversions. They're dress rehearsals for retirement. Build friendships outside your workplace. The golf buddies from your office, the colleagues you grab lunch with, the people you complain about management with, these relationships rarely survive retirement because they were built on shared circumstances, not shared values or genuine connection. Invest in friendships with neighbors, fellow volunteers, people from your faith community, parents from your children's activities. These relationships will sustain you when your work friendships fade. Your health habits in your 40s will determine your quality of life in your 70s. I know you think you have time to get serious about exercise and nutrition later, but your cardiovascular system, your bone density, your muscle mass, your mental sharpness are all being shaped right now by the choices you make every day. The heart attack that changed my life didn't start on November 3rd, 2020. It started with 20 years of poor eating, sporadic exercise, and chronic stress. Ask yourself this question honestly. If you couldn't work tomorrow, who would you be? If your business cards disappeared, your office access was revoked, and your professional title meant nothing, what would give your life meaning and purpose? If you can't answer that question clearly, you have work to do that's more important than any project in your office. For those of you in your 50s, this is your dress rehearsal decade, and you cannot afford to waste it. Take extended vacations not just to relax, but to test retirement activities. Spend 2 weeks with your spouse without the natural separation that work provides. See how you handle unstructured time, unlimited togetherness, and the absence of external validation. If it doesn't go well, you have time to address the problems. Start having honest conversations with your spouse about retirement expectations. My wife and I never talked about the practical realities of being together 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We fantasized about travel and hobbies, but we never discussed how we'd maintain our individual identities and need for personal space. We never talked about household roles, daily routines, or how we'd handle the loss of my income and her increased dependence on me for social interaction. This is the decade to explore career wind-down strategies instead of planning an abrupt stop. Consider transitioning to part-time work, consulting, or different types of employment that might bridge the gap between full-time career and full retirement. The psychological shock of going from 60-hour weeks to zero obligations nearly destroyed me. A gradual transition might have saved me years of struggle. Educate yourself about Medicare, Social Security, and healthcare costs before you need them. The sticker shock of medical expenses in retirement is brutal when you're unprepared for it. Research long-term care insurance, understand the gaps in Medicare coverage, and build healthcare costs into your budget based on reality, not wishful thinking. Try living together 24 hours a day for 2 weeks and see what happens. Take a vacation where you don't have scheduled tours, planned activities, or structured entertainment. Just be together in the same space with time to fill and see how your relationship handles it. If you argue about minor things, feel suffocated, or run out of conversation, you have relationship work to do before retirement. For those of you in your 60s, you're in the final approach, and this is not the time for denial or procrastination. Create meaningful transition ceremonies and rituals for leaving your career. Don't just clean out your office and disappear. Plan a purposeful ending that honors what you've accomplished and consciously bridges your working identity to your retirement identity. Start developing your retirement routine before you retire. Begin volunteering, join organizations, establish exercise habits, and create social connections that will give structure to your post-career days. I wish I'd started my volunteer work while I was still employed, so I could have transitioned from one meaningful role to another instead of falling into a void. Have honest conversations about advanced directives, healthcare advocacy, and end-of-life planning. Make necessary home modifications before you need them, not after a health crisis forces your hand. Install grab bars, improve lighting, consider stair lifts, or single-level living arrangements while you're healthy enough to make rational decisions. I'm asking you, just as a grandfather would ask his own children, are you preparing your heart for retirement or just your wallet? Because the money matters, but it won't sustain you if you don't know who you are or what gives your life meaning. Now, 7 years after my retirement began and 3 years after my heart attack, I can honestly say these are among the best years of my life, not because retirement is easy, but because I finally learned how to do it right. I have purpose through my volunteer work and mentoring. I have structure through my part-time consulting. I have individual identity through my woodworking hobby. And my wife has hers through her pottery classes. We've learned to miss each other again. She goes to her pottery studio 3 mornings a week. I go to my workshop. And when we come together for lunch or dinner, we have stories to share and individual experiences to discuss. We're partners again, not cellmates. I've deepened my relationship with my grandchildren in ways that wouldn't have been possible when I was working 60-hour weeks. I've seen sunrises I never had time to notice, traveled to places we'd only dreamed about, and found peace with mortality and legacy that might never have come without the forced reflection of a health crisis. November 3rd, 2020 wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of my real retirement. That heart attack saved my life by forcing me to live it intentionally instead of just surviving it. The difference between surviving retirement and thriving in it comes down to preparation, not just financial, but emotional, physical, relational, and spiritual. So I'm asking you one final time, are you ready for the most important chapter of your life? Because with proper preparation, it truly can be the best one.